Hi, my name is Mike Obsatz, and I'm Professor Emeritus from Macalester College in St. Paul, where I taught for 40 years in the Education and Sociology departments. And I put together a workshop which is called From Trauma to Trust to Triumph. And I'm going to give you a little taste of what that workshop is like in this video. So we're going to get started and first talk about what a trauma is and the different kinds of trauma. So a trauma is a damage to the mind that occurs as a result of a severely distressing event. It's often the result of an amount of stress that exceeds a person's ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved with the experience. So a trauma can be a one-time event or repeating events which are overwhelming and can be precipitated in weeks, years, or even decades as a person struggles to cope with the circumstances of this event. It differs from person to person. It can be caused by a wide variety of events. They can be events such as an earthquake or a tornado, or there can be a psychological trauma, including harassment or abandonment or rejection or physical or sexual assault or employment discrimination or police brutality or being the victim of an alcoholic parent or the threat of witnessing or the witnessing of violence, particularly in childhood. So what people have very often and related to trauma is a mental disorder called post-traumatic stress disorder. And for some people, it also would include depression and substance abuse. So if you think about all the different kinds of trauma, one would be repeated trauma, and another would be situational trauma, just a one-time event. These are very, very powerful things that happen. And as a result, people get what's called stress disorders, where they can imagine the situation again and again. Trauma can result in a variety of things. It can result in psychologically feeling shameful. It can bring up feelings of rage and anger. It can result in hypervigilance, where people are looking over their shoulder all the time to see if they're safe. Addictions, eating disorders, all kinds of psychological states can come out of a traumatic experience. So there's a book by Alice Miller called Drama of the Gifted Child, and she says that many children in their families grow up with their needs frustrated and feeling unloved and unaccepted, and the reaction to such an experience should be anger and pain, but children stuff this and they don't express their anger and pain. So it comes out in a variety of ways, and not being loved and accepted by your family can result in anxiety, feelings of helplessness, depression, and can result in actual behaviors that hurt oneself, like drug addiction, or behaviors that hurt other people, like criminal behavior or violent behavior. So Alice Miller is saying in The Drama of the Gifted Child that how you're raised as a child can really affect whether you're functioning well, based on whether you felt loved by your parents, whether you felt accepted, whether you had support. Now, beyond the family, there's the peer system and the school system and the larger culture, which can also create trauma for people, such as bullying. Bullying for a lot of children is a traumatic experience and results in a change in brain chemistry because of the fear and the overwhelming helplessness that you can feel during a bullying experience. One of the articles I have by a man named David Hendricks, who's an MD, talks about abuse and says, brain imaging studies of maltreated children revealed a chilling picture. profound structural abnormalities and many critically important brain regions, as well as overall reduction in brain size up to 10%. Since the functions of the various brain regions affected by maltreatment have become generally understood, it is possible to predict the kinds of moods and behaviors likely to develop in kids who are damaged in this way. So it's based on a 1998 publication, Adverse Childhood Experiences, called the ACE study. So children who grew up with verbal, physical, or sexual abuse, children who grew up witnessing a parent being maltreated or hurt physically, a person who grew up with divorce or separation, or one grown up being raised by an addicted or mentally ill or criminal parent. These are all things that can affect the brain. And I would say related to this is that these things are traumas. They're traumatic for people. So a trauma can exist from the time you're very, very small. And it can also happen later in life when you go through a traumatizing experience. So some people experience a trauma during adolescence when they are hurt or abused or raped or violated in any particular way during their adolescent period. Some people even experience traumas as adults if they are married to a dysfunctional, abusive person, for example. So it's very interesting to be aware that there probably are more people who suffered some kind of trauma than people realize. Things that affect a trauma or are related to a trauma are if you're undermined by your family, being convinced that you don't know what you're thinking, your ideas are all wrong, nothing you ever do is right, parents who refuse to listen when you talk, forming alliances that exclude you. All of these things can be undermining to one's self-esteem, one's value and worth, and it can be pretty traumatizing if it goes on for a long time. The kind of abandonments that people experience cause trauma. One would be physical abandonment, where people actually leave you, and if you're a small child and you're left, you think you're going to die. You're going to go out and just no one's going to take care of you and you're going to die. There is not only physical abandonment, but there's also emotional abandonment, where you're not listened to, you're not cared about, kind of the things that Alice Miller is talking about. Emotionally, you don't feel loved and supported. Then there is also self-abandonment, where you learn to not take care of yourself, not to listen to yourself, and you don't express yourself in a way, you pretend to be what you're not, you make choices without thinking. This is a kind of self-abandonment that people go through. So abandonment and undermining are two aspects of the process of growing up that can result in trauma for children. One of the things about trauma that is very significant is very often there is a shame response to trauma. So first of all, you're unloved and unwanted and unaccepted, then you feel shame about who you are. So when shame or negative things come from the outside, very often they become internalized and people feel shame on the inside. This is a very significant thing, to feel shame, feel worthless, feel like your life doesn't mean anything. And it relates to depression, anxiety, drug abuse, and other kinds of negative behaviors that can result in a lot of suffering. One of the things to say about trauma is if you grow up in poverty, if you grow up not getting your needs met as far as your safety needs and you don't feel safe, I think that can be traumatic for a child as well. So we have shame is a very significant thing related to trauma. Shame is a feeling of worthlessness. There are types of shame. Sometimes shame is passed on from generation to generation. So if your great-grandparents were traumatized in the Holocaust, let's say, some of that genetic energy can be transmitted to the parents and then to you. So you can actually get trauma from experiences that you never directly had. That's called cross-generational trauma. There's also cross-generational shame, which is the shame that comes from not feeling worthy and not loved enough. So shame is a very, very significant plays a very significant role related to trauma. And there are ways to heal shame, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. When people have experienced a lot of trauma, one of the things that happens is they believe that they don't belong anywhere. They don't feel accepted. They don't fit anywhere. Their lives are meaningless or empty and not worth anything. Therefore, some people who have a lot of traumatic experiences may attempt to commit suicide, or may suicide over a slow, long period of time using drugs. Now, the trauma can be also a cultural trauma. Like, if you're part of a group of people who are oppressed as a culture, let's say slavery, for example, and you are a slave, it's very likely that you would experience trauma. The way slavery is related to trauma is black families were separated. Mom went to one place, one plantation. Dad went to another one. The children went to other ones. So you actually, in that process, lost all your connections to the people who care and love you, care about you and love you. So any oppressed group, whether it's Native Americans, whether it's African Americans, whether it's gay and lesbian and transgender people, any of those groups have experienced trauma and traumatic experiences. When you're ostracized, when there's no place for you, your mind does not know what to do with that. Your emotions don't know what to do with that, especially if you're really small. So as we move from understanding what trauma is, we move into the area of trust. And the way that people can overcome trauma is that they have to develop a variety of kinds of trust. So Van Sant has a book called Trust, the Four Essential Trusts: trust in self, trust in God, trust in others, and trust in life. And the treatment program that is usually used for trauma includes a variety of psychological techniques, and I'll just share just what a few of them are. One of them is called EMDR, which is a way of moving the eyes to change the brain. It's eye movement desensitization, reprocessing. That is what EMDR stands for. And it is a way to change your brain. And when people experience a trauma, their brain needs to be changed. Hypnotherapy is another way to deal with changing your brain, because it encourages you to relive a traumatic experience and see yourself as strong as opposed to weak. See yourself as handling it as opposed to being a victim of it. There's also a variety of other kinds of, like for example, a variety of treatments. Cognitive behavioral therapy is one example of that. There's also a tapping process, emotional freedom technique, which is another example to try to change the brain. So a trauma doesn't just result in an emotional response, it results in a brain chemistry response. And a lot of people don't understand that. They think they can just treat it as an emotional event, but it very often also has cognitive components to it. Very often a person who has been traumatized thinks differently about life, is fearful, maybe paranoid even about life, hypervigilant, really cautious, generalizing that bad things will happen, catastrophizing, imagining the worst, having a negative rehearsal, believing that negative things will continue to happen. So all of this negativity and this fear is pushed into the brain of a person who has experienced a trauma. So to trust someone is very significant, because you have to trust someone who's providing you with the care that you would need to be treated for trauma. So any therapist of any kind that would work with you have to be trusted. So one of the things that a person has to learn is that there are some people that they can trust to help them treat what the trauma has done to them. So trust is a very, very significant component of that. And I will share from Van Sant just a few ideas about the different kinds of trust. One of them is called trusting the process. Learning to trust comes to us with all of our friends asking to stand naked and vulnerable, facing the unfamiliar without fear, surrendering everything we know and believe in order to receive what we desire. So part of trusting the process is learning to be vulnerable, which is very, very hard for a person who's gone through trauma to do, because vulnerability has always meant negative experience. Any kind of vulnerability has resulted in hurtful, horrible things to happen. When you trust the process, you place your faith in the unknown with no guarantee of the outcome. So trusting the process of life means that you have to believe that it's going to be okay, and someone has to help you learn that, even though it hasn't been okay before. So one of the ways you learn that everything is going to be okay is you have to find supportive people in your life. Trusting other people who will care about you and support you is very, very important, and finding those people. So one of the qualities involved in trust is discernment, finding out who you can really trust, and then going ahead and learning to be vulnerable again, and processing what you went through in a safe environment. And that's where therapists come in hand to help. That's where spiritual counselors can be helpful. That's where AA programs are helpful. It's creating an environment of safety for people to deal with the traumatic experiences that they have had. So there's trust in others, very specifically how you can trust others who will be there for you and create safety for you. Sometimes people have been betrayed. Sometimes people have been abused. Sometimes people have been lied to. All of these things in the past create more difficulty in trusting. I think trusting is one of the absolutely most important things about life. And trusting others that you select is really crucial. Then you have to trust yourself and really believe that you know what you need, that you deserve to be loved, that you're worthy of your own trust. And what Van Sant says is trust yourself because you're worthy of your own time, energy, attention, and love. You, as a demonstration and a representative of the presence of the Creator in the world, deserve and are worthy of your own trust. That's pretty powerful, to learn to trust yourself. Lots of times when people have been traumatized, it's very hard for them to trust themselves. They don't believe in themselves. They believe that they're victims of circumstances, they're victims of other people. Without self-trust, you will underutilize your personal power to make choices and facilitate change. So we have 4 kinds of trust here, which are really, really very significant. Trusting in yourself, trusting in others, trusting in God, and then trusting in the process of life, that everything will be okay. Ann Wilson Schaefer wrote a book called Living in Process, and she said, life is an ongoing process of teaching and learning is a process. Living in process means giving up of control. Now, that's a very powerful thing, because when a person is traumatized, it's very hard to give up control, because a person is then scared that if they're not in control, the trauma will happen again. And giving up control is part of learning to trust. That means that there are certain things we cannot control. And David Rico has written a book called The 5 Things We Cannot Change. And I think I can remember most of what those things are that we cannot change. And they are that everything changes and ends, that people aren't loving and loyal all the time, that not everything goes according to plan, that suffering is a part of life, and that life isn't always fair. And if you can accept those and realize there are positive things that come out of those things, then you can let go of control. So very often people who have control issues end up with, for example, eating disorders. Eating disorder is about control. Other kind of disorders are about control, like having to have things everywhere exactly the way you want them, and be obsessive and compulsive about things. That's about control. Being a people pleaser or a caretaker of other people is also about control. Manipulating and lying can also be about control, like trying to dominate and control other people. The one thing that I didn't mention about trusting God is the importance of the concept of grace. That grace is a very, very significant aspect of trusting in God. So God's grace is everywhere and around us and all the time present. We don't always experience it or know it, but it's still there. So Lewis Smedes, in his book Shame and Grace, talks about how we experience grace. And he says, we experience grace as pardon. We're forgiven for the wrongs we have done. And pardoning grace is the answer to guilt. That's pretty powerful. We experience grace as pardon. So we are forgiven. Therefore, we can forgive ourselves and we can forgive others. That doesn't mean we have to hang around with abusive people. It just means internally we forgive others. We experience grace as acceptance. He says, we are reunited with God and our true selves, accepted, cradled, held, affirmed, and loved. Accepting grace is the answer to shame. So the antidote for shame, or the answer to shame, is to accept that we are loved and accepted by God, no matter what people have done to us in the past. That is an extremely powerful thing to believe. We experience grace as power. It provides a spiritual energy to shed the heaviness of shame and in the lightness of grace move toward the true self God means us to be. So grace gives us the power to trust in ourselves and then to act in a way that is going to help us have the best possible life. And when we have that, we can share that with other people. And we experience grace as gratitude. This gives us a sense for the gift of life and the sense of wonder and elation at the lavish generosity of God. And I think that is incredibly important. The idea that God loves us, that God accepts us, that God is generous with us, that God is there for us. So even though a part of us suffered the trauma, the human part, the physical part, the spiritual part was always loved by God, was always accepted and protected by God. So part of the healing of our traumatic experiences is moving away from what happened with people toward what always was there with God. So it's making a spiritual life your priority. Your energy goes in a spiritual direction, and you let go of what happened with people and realize that it wasn't really about your true essence. It was only about your form. So it's kind of an interesting idea that you can actually experience trauma and on the other hand believe that there was a part of you that was always lovable, always loved, and always taken care of. It's a real challenge to move that way. But that is how, through trust, people can begin to heal. The healing process from trauma can be long, can take a lot of different approaches, but it usually has to involve emotional and spiritual and behavioral and cognitive ways of being. In other words, we don't just solve it by thinking. We have to change our thinking, yes, but that doesn't do it alone. We also have to change how we feel. We also have to change our spiritual connection, get it to be really the central core of who we are. That's another major change. And as a result of all that, our behaviors can then change. that means we are more willing to open up. We are more willing to be vulnerable. So the power of grace is really about the healing power that can exist when a person really connects spiritually with God in whatever form they believe God to be, and knows that they are lovable just as they are. They've always been lovable, and that's the main thing about them. So any labels, any categories, nobody can hurt you anymore, because that's not who you are. And you know you're not just that. You are a child of God. You are a child of the universe. That is who you are. And that becomes one of the main ways that we heal, is through that process. Marianne Williamson, in her book Return to Love, talks about who we really are. And she says, when we were born, we were programmed perfectly. We had a natural tendency to focus on love. So what happened? Because we were taught to focus on fear, we were taught to think unnaturally, we were taught a very bad philosophy, a way of looking at the world that contradicts who we really are. So what she's basically saying is trauma is an experience that can cause you to think from a fear-oriented direction. And it can change your brain from the love-centeredness that you start out being to a fear-centered human being. We were taught to think things like competition, struggle, finite resources, guilt, death, scarcity, and loss. These were all important. We began to think these things, so we began to know them. We were taught that we are separate from other people, that we have to compete to get ahead, that we're not quite good enough as we are. We were taught to see the world the way others had come to see it. It is as though as soon as we got here, we were giving a sleeping pill. The thinking of the world, which is not based on love, began pounding in our ears the moment we hit the shore. Love is what we're born with. Fear is what we learned here. The spiritual journey is the relinquishing or unlearning of fear and the acceptance of love back into our hearts. Now that's an incredible thing to think about. The spiritual journey is the acceptance of love back into our hearts and relinquishing or unlearning of fear. So basically what she's talking about is whatever fearful experiences we've had, whatever traumas we've endured, we can see them as part of the human condition, but that never affected our wholeness and our spirituality and our connection with God. And once we start focusing more on God, and once we start focusing on our connection to each other in a healthy, positive way, we then learn that all fear comes from separation, and all fear comes from the idea that the other is different from us. So oneness is a very big solution to trauma, and seeing the oneness of all creation, oneness of ourselves and all other people. And that oneness is what gets us through any difficult time we will have in the future. So I came up with 16 affirmations of living a triumphant life. This is how we're moving into being triumphant. After we've experienced the trauma, after we've gone through the trust, and now we get to live a life which is a triumphant life, a life of power, a life of joy, instead of a life of fear. So here are some of the triumphant affirmations and ideas about what triumphant living is like. So a person who lives triumphantly has focus and purpose. They believe that there's a reason for them to be alive, and they focus on what their purpose is. What are they going to be and do in the world? So an affirmation would be, I know and live my purpose. Another aspect of a triumphant life is resilience, and that involves courage. I bounce back from difficult situations. We've all gone through very hard things and have bounced back. In the movie Simon Birch, he says, because he has deformities, he says, I'm a walking miracle. Well, I think most people are walking miracles too. They bounce back from something really, really hard. Resilience is another way of living in a triumphant life. The third is having a positive attitude and gratitude. So people who are triumphant try to see the positive aspects of things and are grateful for all the good that they have in their lives. They don't focus on what they don't have. They don't focus on how bad it's been. They focus on how connected they are to God, how much they are loved, and how grateful they are for everything that they've been given. And one way to thank God is to use those things you've been given to help serve other people. So another aspect of the triumphant kind of life is one of generosity. I care about others, I'm generous with my time, I pay it forward, and I have compassion for others. So with this generosity also comes a decision not to judge everybody, not to be critical, not to be negative, to be grateful and generous with what you have. Another aspect of triumphant living is co-creation, co-creating with Spirit, making beautiful things happen in the world with the support of God in your life. Another one is called presence, living in the moment, being fully present. Another one is flow. I go with the flow and relax into my destiny, where I go with the flow, which means trusting and going with the process and accepting that your life will mean something and you can go with the flow of your life and be joyful and resilient and positive about yourself as you do that. It's very, very powerful to flow. Flow is related to focus and purpose too. The more you flow, the more you can realize your purpose in life. Integration, to integrate your mind, emotions, body, and spirit. So to have an integrated life where all of these things sort of are together, are whole, are performing in a way that all fulfill each other, are connected to each other. A very important skill in having a triumphant life is navigation. The ability to navigate life's challenges. Whatever is going on, to be able to see a way through it and to figure out a path that will work. That is navigation, and navigation is very much a sign of someone living triumphantly, navigating positively through hard experiences. Just like a canoe navigating the channels, going through the channels of the rapids, of the waves, of the rocks, and actually trying to avoid what can be harmful. Forgiveness. One of the things about forgiveness is forgiving and loving yourself and realizing that whatever occurred in your life was for your highest good, no matter how bad it may have seemed. For example, if you've been through a hard experience like bullying, it makes you more compassionate to people who've been bullied. It also gives you ideas about what people who are bullied really feel and what you can do about it, and what you would have liked to have done for you, maybe you can do for somebody else. So out of negative experiences can come very positive life changes if you see life that way. Authenticity, living your own authentic life with passion. That's pretty powerful to live triumphantly like that. Knowing who you are, living from your authentic self, and having a passion for things, being excited, seeing the awe, seeing the wonder, seeing the magic, because we are all magical beings, but very often we don't see how magical we are. Self-care, I take care of myself and I take care of my needs and my feelings, and that's a very important thing for people who live triumphantly, is to be careful of their own needs and feelings and make sure that they're doing what they need to do to stay healthy, to stay fulfilled. Channel, I'm a channel for God's love. When people get to a state of triumphant living, what they realize is that they are a channel for something greater than them, which we could call God. And that love can flow through us to the world and make a difference in a lot of ways. We can't solve everything and we can't fix everything, but by being a loving being and really caring, we can provide some hope and some positivity in a world that can be pretty negative and pretty destructive at times. And then the most important thing is seeing the oneness of all creation, that we are all created and we are all connected and we are all part of each other. And all hatred that exists in the world is really self-hatred directed outwardly toward others. So one of the things to do is to love yourself, know that you are lovable, and the more you do that, the less critical, judgmental, and negative you will be toward other people. So we've taken this little journey, and we've gone through the experiences of trauma and all the different kinds of side effects that trauma can have, and how much power trauma can have in people's lives. Through the process of trusting, and how we learn to trust, how we learn to trust ourselves, trust in God, trust in the process of life, and trust in selected other people to be safe, to provide safety and support for us as we go through the life choices that we're going to go through. Trust is the vehicle to move from trauma to triumph. There has to be trust. And it has to be trust in spirit in whatever form that works for you, as well as trust in yourself, believing that you can do what you need to do to have the life that you want to have. And finally, just being triumphant is to celebrate all the good that you have, and then to share that with other people, and then to provide service in some kind of meaningful way that helps other people feel God's love and presence, the love and presence of other caring people, and the hope that everything will turn out all right, and that everything will be all right. Because that's really what every child needs to hear, what every adolescent needs to hear, and what every grown-up needs to hear, is that I believe in you, I believe you can handle what you need to handle, and everything will be all right. And that is the way we move from trauma through trust to triumph. So I hope this has given you some ideas about this process. And again, we go through it, and then something else comes up, and maybe we have to go through it again. So it isn't like you go through this once and you figured it all out, but you're constantly living in a trust state where you're going to deal with whatever is challenging and hard, whatever might be traumatic, and turning it into something that you can work from and create something good out of, and then live in a way that is meaningful for you and then supportive and helpful to other people. So, I love you, I bless you, I behold the God connection in you in whatever form that takes, and I wish you well. Thank you for listening to this and watching it.